Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about chapters 12 and 13 to go a little bit deeper with our aggregate supply and aggregate demand model and analyze the two major schools of thought in terms of macroeconomics. So these two major schools are called the Keynesian school and the Neoclassical school. We're going to start off today talking about the Keynesian perspective. So this Keynesian perspective is associated with Keynes' law, which we already discussed. And this is just the idea that aggregate demand or total spending on goods and services is what's going to determine real GDP or the actual level of output in an economy. So just to get us started, here's our graph of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. We're measuring output on the horizontal axis and the price level on the vertical axis. I have my downward sloping aggregate demand curve, my upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, and my long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical at my potential level of output, or that full employment GDP. Now, the main purpose of this Keynesian perspective is that demand creates its own supply. So if aggregate demand is not high enough to encourage full production, then our economy is going to fall into what's called a recessionary gap. And that is what's illustrated here. So in this model, my short-run equilibrium is happening at this point E, where my aggregate demand curve intersects my short-run aggregate supply curve. And the short-run equilibrium is always telling me my actual level of output, or my level of real GDP. And what we see here is that right now, my actual level of output is less than my potential level of output. We call this a recessionary gap. My economy is producing below its potential GDP. We still have the same number of workers, the same amount of resources, the same technology, but for some reason, we're just not producing at our full capacity. On the other hand, my economy could also be operating at a point like this. So here, my economy is in what we call an inflationary gap. So my short-run equilibrium now puts my actual level of output above my potential level of output. And so what we want to understand here is that it's not always a given that our economy is going to be in a long-run equilibrium and producing at its potential level of output. Recall that a long-run equilibrium happens when all three of my curves intersect at the same point. So that real GDP, or my actual level of output, is equal to full employment GDP. This is really important for us to understand from the Keynesian perspective because Keynes argued that aggregate demand is not automatically going to be at the right level to make sure that we're producing at potential GDP. Sometimes aggregate demand falls too low, as it does in a recession, or aggregate demand gets too large, and this pulls our economy a little bit out of whack. All right, so this Keynesian perspective is going to be mostly used when we're trying to analyze short-run fluctuations in the economy and prescribing solutions to those short-run fluctuations. This Keynesian view is based on two key building blocks. This idea that aggregate demand is going to determine our actual level of output, and it gives us a reason as to why the economy cannot easily adjust or easily correct itself when we fall into a recession. So if you think back to the 2008 recession, the Great Recession, or even the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting recession, during those times, the government often provides some type of support or stimulus to the economy to help us get back on track from the recession. And this type of stimulus follows directly from this Keynesian perspective. So if you receive stimulus checks during COVID, or if you receive some kind of tax cut during COVID, these are things that the government does to try and assist the economy to get us out of a recession and get us back to producing at full employment GDP. So from the Keynesian perspective, why do recessions occur? Sometimes our economy falls into a recession because aggregate demand just simply isn't high enough. Total spending on goods and services in the economy dips below what we're able to produce, and then our real GDP falls below our full employment GDP. So anything that can shift aggregate demand or reduce aggregate demand can cause a recession. A decrease in consumer spending or investment spending, a decrease in net exports, or a decrease in government spending. So if we have a decrease in any one of these four factors in our spending equation of GDP, this can cause a decrease in our total spending. So we get into this recession, we have some decrease in aggregate demand. Let's imagine that this is because we have a decrease in consumer confidence. So consumers become less confident in the overall state of the economy. This causes them to want to save more money because they're worried about a recession coming up. And so they actually reduce their spending. The result of this is that they can actually create this recession that they're worried about. Aggregate demand falls, our economy moves to a new short-run equilibrium, and now our actual level of output has fallen below our potential level of output. Now, why do we get stuck in this recession? Another key part of this Keynesian analysis was the idea that the economy is not just going to self-correct when we land in this recession. Keynes argued that the government needed to do something to try and boost aggregate demand to get us back on track. And the reason Keynes believed that we would get stuck in this recessionary gap is due to the idea of sticky wages and prices. And what we mean by this when we say that prices and wages are sticky is that in the short run, wages and prices do not adjust very quickly to shocks to the macroeconomy. So just think about it this way. If you are working in a job where you get paid an hourly wage, and then all of a sudden the economy starts falling into a recession, next time you clock into work, you're not going to be happy if your boss tells you that your wage is going down, right? That's not something you're going to be willing to accept. So in the short run, wages and prices tend to, kind of hold the line. They don't adjust rapidly to a decrease in aggregate demand, and this prevents the economy from self-adjusting. Just like we talked about in the supply and demand model, fluctuations in prices are what allow a market or an economy to self-equilibrate. If prices and wages are sticky, then we're going to get stuck in this recessionary gap, and this is why Keynes argued that the government should step in and try to push the economy back on track. So not only are wages sticky, but prices for other goods can be sticky too. I think as we've seen with all of these tariff announcements in the past year or so, many businesses were sort of hesitant to change the prices for their products out of fear of pushing away their customers. So businesses might be hesitant to change their prices even when the economy falls into a recession because of several different reasons. One, a business might not want to confuse or anger customers by changing its prices, but two, it can actually be costly for a business to update its prices. And so economists call the money spent for a firm to update its prices a menu cost. We can think of this as, a restaurant having to go through all of its menus and update the prices for all of its food items if it wants to raise prices. So because firms are going to have to spend some money to change their own prices, and they don't want to confuse or anger their consumers, prices for regular goods might also be sticky in the short run. If we land in a recession because aggregate demand falls too low, and we get stuck in this recession because wages and prices are sticky and the economy cannot self-equilibrate, what should we do when we get into a recession? What Keynes argued is that the government should step in to resolve a macroeconomic problem like this. Keynes argued that the government has a lot of power in terms of adjusting its own level of spending or influencing spending done by consumers and businesses through tax laws. So the government should do something to alter aggregate demand and push the economy back on track. So a key part of this is something that we call the expenditure multiplier. And this is just the idea that if the government changes its own level of spending, not only is that going to have a direct impact on aggregate demand, but that will also have a kind of domino effect through the economy and increase spending by other businesses and consumers. So we can think about this by using a simple example. Let's imagine that the government decides to increase spending by signing a new contract with Boeing. So the government decides to sign a new contract with Boeing, and they're going to buy some new planes. So this is, of course, going to increase government spending. But when the government spends this money at Boeing, it becomes income to the employees at Boeing, right? So some of these employees at Boeing are going to be making some extra money. And when these employees at Boeing make some extra money, they might turn around and spend some of that. So now we have these consumers, these employees at Boeing, that are going out and spending some of this new income. Maybe they spend it at the mall, buying some new clothes. So consumer spending goes up, When these Boeing employees go out and buy new clothes at the mall, that money becomes income for the employees that work at the mall. Then those employees that work at the mall can turn around and spend some of that new income. Maybe they buy some groceries with it. And so this original spending done by the government is going to flow through the economy in a circular way as it gets spent over and over. And so the result here from this initial increase in government spending is going to be a much larger total increase in aggregate demand. And so we call this the multiplier effect. When the government increases its spending, that spending is going to be multiplied through the economy. It's going to cause an even greater increase in aggregate demand. Now, what determines the size of this multiplier effect? The size of this multiplier effect is determined by something that we call the marginal propensity to consume. And all this means is when you get some new income, how much of it are you going to spend and how much of it are you going to save? If people have a greater marginal propensity to consume, meaning that they want to spend a larger proportion of their new income, then this multiplier effect will be very large. If people are more thrifty, they like to save their money, and they have a smaller marginal propensity to consume, then the multiplier effect will be a little bit more modest or not as strong. We land in this recession because we had a decrease in aggregate demand. We get stuck there because of sticky wages and prices. But Keynes argued that the government can come to the rescue. They can increase their own level of spending, or they can cut taxes on households and businesses to increase spending in other ways. And this will push aggregate demand back up. And if done correctly, it can push us back to our long-run equilibrium, where we'll once again be producing at potential GDP. This Keynesian prescription for what the government should do when the economy enters a recession or an inflationary period can be distilled down into two types of fiscal policy. If our economy falls into a recession, then Keynes would argue that the government should use what is called expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy is implemented when the government either increases its own spending or decreases taxes to boost aggregate demand. By boosting aggregate demand, they can push us back towards potential GDP. On the other hand, if the economy is in an inflationary gap and aggregate demand is too high, then Keynes would argue that the government can implement contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy is implemented when the government either reduces its own spending or increases taxes to try and reduce aggregate demand and push us back down towards potential GDP. The last key point that we want to talk about with this Keynesian perspective is the trade-off between unemployment and inflation for an economy in the short run. So if we look at our ASAD model, we know that if we fall into a recessionary gap, if our real GDP is below our potential GDP, this means that we must have some cyclical unemployment. So remember that if we're producing at potential GDP, we're at that natural rate of unemployment. Unemployment never goes to zero. But if we're producing less than our potential, this means that unemployment is even higher. What we see from this graph is that when real GDP falls below potential, we know that unemployment goes up, but we also see that the price level goes down. So as unemployment increases, the price level or inflation falls. On the other hand, if we have some increase in aggregate demand that pushes us into an inflationary gap, then we know that unemployment is very low. It's below the natural rate of unemployment. So as real GDP increases, unemployment decreases, but our price level increases, or we have some upward pressure or inflation of prices. So our aggregate supply and aggregate demand model can implicitly show us this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. As one goes up, the other goes down. But we can also draw a new graph called the Phillips Curve to more explicitly illustrate this trade-off between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So the Phillips Curve is just a new graph that we can use to more explicitly illustrate this trade-off between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. Now, this trade-off between unemployment and inflation is only going to hold in the short run. So it's very well aligned with this Keynesian perspective. Now, when we draw this Phillips curve, we're going to measure the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, and we measure that unemployment rate as a percentage. Then we're going to measure our inflation rate, again, as a percentage on the vertical axis. Now here is what the shape of our Phillips curve will look like in the short run. So here is my short run Phillips curve, and it's going to have this downward sloping shape. This shows us that as unemployment increases, inflation will decrease, and vice versa. So if my economy is starting at a point like this, we'll call this point A, inflation is relatively high, and unemployment is relatively low. Let's say that here, unemployment is at 2%, and inflation is at 7%. If the government wants to implement some kind of policy to help reduce the inflation rate, they would need to implement some contractionary fiscal policy, something to reduce aggregate demand, pull output down, and reduce that inflationary pressure on prices. But in doing so, they're going to push unemployment up. When we reduce aggregate demand and reduce real GDP, unemployment has to rise. So this contractionary fiscal policy could push the economy down to a new point like point B. At point B, inflation will be much lower, but unemployment will have to be higher. Depending on the point on our Phillips curve that we're currently operating at, we can also make some assumptions about the current state of the economy. For example, if we're at a point like this, at point A, where inflation is very high and unemployment is very low, I might assume that my economy is overheating or in this inflationary gap. If unemployment is very low, output must be very high, and when output is high in an inflationary gap, we expect to see strong upward pressure on prices. On the other hand, if my economy is operating at a point that's here on the very far bottom right of my Phillips curve, unemployment is very high, but inflation is very low. Here we might expect to be in a recessionary gap. When output is low, unemployment is high, but we don't expect to see a whole lot of pressure on prices. We can also be at a kind of Goldilocks point. We might be at a point here in the middle of my Phillips curve where I have both a moderate level of unemployment and a moderate rate of inflation. Just to recap, this Keynesian perspective is best aligned when looking at economic fluctuations in the short run. It tells us that aggregate demand is the most important determinant for our actual level of output or real GDP in an economy, and that we get into a recession when aggregate demand is too low. We get stuck in these recessions because of sticky wages and prices that do not adjust very quickly in the short run, and so the economy cannot self-equilibrate. From this, we get the idea that the government should implement fiscal policy to correct the economy when we get off track. If we enter a recession, we need expansionary fiscal policy to boost aggregate demand. If we enter an inflationary period, we need contractionary fiscal policy to bring us back down to potential GDP. Lastly, we drew our Phillips curve, which just illustrates this trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the short run. Now let's take a look at our other prevailing macroeconomic school of thought, which is the Neoclassical Perspective. So the Neoclassical Perspective was the dominant school of macroeconomic thought up until Keynes proposed his ideology in about the 1930s, 1940s. Now, the Neoclassical Perspective aligns with Say's law, and it's a great perspective for looking at the long term or the long run of a macroeconomy. And so because this Neoclassical Perspective aligns with Say's law, the belief here is that aggregate supply or production is what's going to determine our actual level of output or our real GDP. So in this Neoclassical Perspective, we're not concerned about aggregate demand. Instead, we're concerned about how much stuff can be produced. So the focus here is that supply creates its own demand. So this Neoclassical Perspective is based on two key building blocks. The idea that aggregate supply is going to determine the size of our economy or our level of output, and the belief that prices are flexible in the long run. When prices and wages are able to adjust, this allows the economy to self-correct when it falls into a recession or into an inflationary period. So the Neoclassical Perspective directly opposes what we talked about in the Keynesian perspective, and the idea is that here in the long run, supply will determine our actual level of output, and if we experience some short-term fluctuation that causes output to deviate from our potential level, these flexible prices are going to allow the economy to self-adjust and get back on track without any assistance from the government. This first building block here, that aggregate supply is what determines the size of the economy, is centered around potential GDP. So our potential to produce all of the resources and technology that an economy has access to is going to determine the actual level of output in that economy. So whatever amount of land, labor, capital, and technology we have available to us is going to determine how much stuff we can produce, and that potential level of GDP is going to determine our real level of GDP in the long run. So what can influence potential GDP? As we talked about in our discussion of chapter 11, potential GDP can be changed if we have some increase in productivity growth. We know that when we have productivity growth in our aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, both my short-run aggregate supply curve and my long-run aggregate supply curve are going to shift to the right. If I have more resources or better technology, my potential or capacity to produce is going to increase. So some of the things that can affect our potential GDP would be investments in capital. This can be physical capital like equipment, machinery, factories, or this can be investment in what we call human capital. Human capital is education, skills, or other experience that workers can learn that will make them more efficient at producing or make them better at their jobs. So if the government is focusing on investing in physical or human capital, this can improve productivity and increase potential GDP. Potential GDP can also be increased if we have improvements in technology. The other key building block here for this neoclassical perspective is that even though wages and prices might be sticky in the short run, it's believed that they are flexible in the long run. So anytime the economy experiences some fluctuation in aggregate demand, in the short run, this might cause a change in output, but in the long run, we'll return to producing at this potential level of output because prices will adjust to push us back to that equilibrium. Using our ASAD model, let's see how these flexible prices can get us back to long-run equilibrium after some shock to aggregate demand. So we'll start in our long-run equilibrium here, where all three of my curves are intersecting at the same point. This tells me that my economy is actually producing at potential GDP, and the price level is at this expected price level. Let's imagine that we have some increase in aggregate demand. So we know that aggregate demand can increase if we have an increase in consumer or firm confidence, an increase in government spending, a tax cut, or a decrease in the interest rate. So we have something that happens that pushes aggregate demand up, our aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, and this moves our economy to a new short-run equilibrium. At this new short-run equilibrium, we'll call this E2, my economy enters this inflationary gap where it's producing above its potential level of output. We also have some upward pressure on prices. Now, when we enter this inflationary gap, my economy is producing above its potential level of output, and this means that unemployment is unsustainably low. We're below that natural rate of unemployment, and this makes it difficult for suppliers to keep up with this really strong demand. So firms across the economy are competing for one another for resources to produce in order to keep up with aggregate demand. Businesses are having to bid up wages in order to attract new employees. They're having to pay higher and higher prices for capital equipment. And so what this is going to do is this is going to decrease our aggregate supply in the short run. When the price of labor or the price of other inputs increases because production is trying to keep up with this strong demand, it's going to be more expensive for our firms to produce. So my short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. And this is allowing my economy to get back on track or to get back to that long-run equilibrium. Because prices were able to adjust, wages and other prices rose, our economy falls back to produce at potential GDP, and all we're left with is an increase in the price level or inflation. So from this neoclassical perspective, we're really focused on the long-run aggregate supply curve. The long-run aggregate supply curve at potential GDP is determining the size of my economy in the long run. In the long run, we can't produce any more output than our potential GDP. So any change in aggregate demand is just going to result in a change in the price level. Now let's show this same type of macroeconomic adjustment but when we have a decrease in aggregate demand. So again, we're starting from long-run equilibrium. My economy is operating at potential GDP. Then we have some decrease in aggregate demand. This pushes my aggregate demand curve to the left, and we end up at a new short-run equilibrium point in a recessionary gap. So now my economy is producing below potential GDP, and we see that there's been some downward movement in prices. When our economy starts producing below potential GDP, we know that unemployment has gone up. And what we expect to see happen here is that wages are going to kind of stagnate or maybe even decrease. So a lot of times during a recession, people lose their jobs or they can't get a job in their original high-paying industry, so they have to move into lower-paying lines of work. So wages are going to fall. The prices of other inputs may also fall due to this downward pressure on prices, and this is going to increase aggregate supply in the short run. If wages and the price of other inputs go down, this is going to incentivize our producers to supply more. So my short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. And again, because we have this flexibility in prices in the long run, our economy can self-correct and get back to producing at potential GDP, with the only lasting effect of this change being a decrease in the price level. Okay, so when we say that the economy is self-adjusting in the long run through this neoclassical perspective, really what we mean is that all of the different actors in our economy are making their own decisions, and together these decisions are causing the economy to get back on track. So when we want to know how quickly this macroeconomic adjustment is going to happen on its own, we want to know, how good people are at predicting or expecting what's going to happen in the face of some macroeconomic shock, like a shock to aggregate demand. So there's two major perspectives on this. The first is that people have rational expectations. If we say that people have rational expectations, then we believe that they have the ability to make the most accurate possible predictions given all the information available to them. So if people have rational expectations, macroeconomic adjustment is going to happen very quickly. People will see what's going to happen in the economy, and they will immediately adjust their behavior because they know what to expect. Again, this may not be the most realistic, depending on your opinion, but we can instead believe that people have adaptive expectations. And if we say that people have adaptive expectations, this just means that people learn as they go, and as they observe past events and learn from what happened in the economy before, they update their behaviors and expectations using that information. So if in the past I had seen a recession happen, but I didn't know how to respond to that or what to expect, then I might not have behaved perfectly correctly in that previous recession. But now when a new recession happens, I know what's going to happen, and so I can update my behavior accordingly. So this idea of adaptive expectations, or that people learn as they go, will slow the speed of macroeconomic adjustment, but over time, people will get better and better at making these kinds of decisions. Okay, so in this neoclassical perspective, we said the economy is going to adjust on its own due to these flexible wages and prices. So the government has no job anymore, right? With the Keynesian perspective, we said the government needs to step in if we have some macroeconomic fluctuation. But neoclassicals are saying that the government should take a hands-off approach. But this isn't to say that the government should just do nothing. Instead, what neoclassical economists will argue is that the government should focus on increasing potential GDP, so focusing on productivity growth, and also reducing the natural rate of unemployment. So neoclassical economists don't want the government to worry about real output or unemployment in the short run. Instead, they want them to focus on increasing our capacity to produce and reducing that natural rate of unemployment along with it. The idea here is that if the government focuses on productivity growth, our economy will be able to grow gradually over time. So as we showed here on our graph, the reason neoclassical economists don't want the government to use aggregate demand or fiscal policy to correct the economy is because they believe that changes in aggregate demand will only cause changes in the price level, or they'll only cause inflation. So instead, if we focus on increasing our productivity, our economy will be able to grow over time. So what kind of things can the government do to increase productivity or reduce the natural rate of unemployment? Number one, the government can focus on investing in physical capital or human capital. So this could be investments in equipment, machinery, or of course education. And the government can also invest in research and innovation for new technologies. Anytime we get more capital equipment or new technology, our economy should be able to produce more. The government can also improve productivity by trying to reduce the natural rate of unemployment. So neoclassicals don't want the government to worry about cyclical unemployment that comes and goes as we enter or leave recessions. Instead, they want the government to focus on reducing frictional and structural unemployment. These are the kinds of unemployment that we always have. So the government can implement job matching agencies to help reduce frictional unemployment and match workers into jobs more quickly. Or the government can provide retraining programs to get people back into the workforce sooner after they lose their job to some new technology. All right, the last thing I want to point out here is that because neoclassical economists are focused on potential GDP or supply determining the size of our economy, they're focused on this long-run aggregate supply curve, there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the long run. So in the long run, if our actual level of output is going to be centered around potential GDP, our actual level of unemployment is going to be centered around the employment rate that is associated with potential GDP. And this would be our natural rate of unemployment. So if I wanted to draw a Phillips curve for the long run or for this neoclassical perspective, it would simply be a vertical line at my natural rate of unemployment. This is because in the long run, there's nothing I can do with aggregate demand to influence my actual level of output. That is only determined by my resources available to me, only determined by the capacity to produce. So if I want to look at my unemployment rate in the long run, or this trade-off between unemployment and inflation, there is none. If I try to increase aggregate demand to boost output and reduce unemployment, that's going to be frivolous. I'm going to be stuck at this potential level of GDP, and all I'm going to be left with is an increase in the price. So that's what our Phillips curve here is showing too. There's nothing I can do to try and push my actual unemployment rate away from the natural rate. Anything that I do is only going to show up as a change in the inflation rate. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.